All right, so this is the lecture 7 on respiration physiology from Williams and Watson. Watson can't be here right now because he's outside peeing. So that's the truth. Hang on, let's see if I can go to the next one. Oh, this is awesome. Okay. So oxygen and respiration during exercise. And I'm going to give you the reason why I use a lot of drawing and a lot of words in here. It's because these pictures are just gorgeous, but there's no way that you can reproduce it during a test or even trying to explain things. So I'm going to give you sort of the sketchy kinds of things that I do because I think it helps you to remember it. So draw along if you can. And I'm going to show you this picture. Some of you have been in animal physiology, but it's not so much the athlete on top of the horse that I'm interested in this picture. It's the athlete that is below the below the rider. And these horses just give you, this is the Kentucky Derby. I think it was last year. No, it wasn't. It was 2 years ago because Triple Crown winner. And the interesting thing is that I could look at these horses and I now want to go to a track because I can pick out the winner, and you should be able to also. Oh, hang on, there's a note there. So anyway, if you looked at these pictures and just said, I'm going to pick the winning horse, and despite the fact that the one is in the front, it was the winner, and it was the Triple Crown winner. There was one feature that just was so clear in terms of making an athlete. And it's the same for humans too. And you'd think it was longer legs. You would think that the longer stride would make it faster and everything. And the thing that is so apparent here, I can get this to go, is this. When you look at that animal, look at the difference in the size of the lungs that horse has. And that is the same for humans. When we start to talk about, especially endurance athletes, we're looking at morphological features. Yes, longer legs might be good for certain kinds of activities, but the thing that is so important is how much oxygen can you bring in, what's your VO2 max, and can you stay aerobic for a long period of time, no matter what you're doing? Because if you can't stay aerobic, yes, you can go anaerobic, but the problem is if you're trying to exercise for more than a minute, lactic acid buildup is going to stop you and lead to a level of exhaustion. So just remember this picture in terms of the size of the chest for a horse. People have been breeding these animals for centuries. And the truth is, the thing that has come out of all of it is that if you want a winner, you want one that can bring in a heck of a lot of oxygen as you're exercising. And this is the cycle I would like you to remember. You don't have to be able to draw the human that's in the middle of it, but I want you to appreciate that we've got oxygen movement that we're concerned about, and we'll be talking a lot about it, but also don't forget that we've got carbon dioxide movement that's happening on the other side. And in many ways, this is going to be critical. And you know what I realized here? I think I have all my notes on here already. Okay, well, we'll just sort of go with it. As far as, I'm getting thrown off by the notes I've already written, sorry. As far as this oxygen movement pathway, we're bringing in oxygen-rich air as we're breathing. It's got to go to the blood. So we're going from lungs to the blood. We're going to be taking that oxygen, turning it into ATP for our exercising muscles. And that's one half of the process. So we've only gotten from oxygen in, getting it to the muscles. We're now doing really, really well. But we have to get rid of all of that extra carbon dioxide. And that is an issue in terms of the control of respiration, the control of our whole oxygen CO2 cycle. And that's the fact that carbon dioxide is going to be driving what your pulmonary ventilation is going to look like. So we now have carbon dioxide rich blood coming out of the muscles, going up towards the lungs. We're going to exhale that O2, and then we're going to start the cycle all over again. So for you, in terms of understanding this graph, just make sure you've got sort of a sense of where oxygen is along this pathway, and then where the carbon dioxide comes in. And as we talk about controlling our breathing, it's really going to be carbon dioxide, not the oxygen, that controls that. But in terms of the athlete, we're always seeming to be interested in the oxygen more than anything else. And it's because we don't want to go into anaerobic levels of exercise. So I'm going to erase this just so that it's a little bit clearer. And so ultimately, if you take a look at what's going on for the control of your respiration, it's carbon dioxide. It's what happens with the amount of CO2 that's in your blood that's going to drive whether you're going to be taking a lot of deep breaths, whether you're going to be breathing slowly, or whether you're going to increase your ventilation. And that's what these two graphs are showing you. This is just breaths per minute, so how many times you're breathing. And this is just how much air you're actually moving. And if you're breathing just normal room air, which is shown in the middle graph here, it really doesn't change your either your vital capacities, in other words, how much air you're bringing in. It doesn't change your breathing rate, so how many breaths you're taking per minute. If you give somebody oxygen, so that's shown by the slower curve right here, so 100% oxygen, it really isn't cutting down your respiration rate all that much, or your vital capacity all that much. But look what happens if you add carbon dioxide into the air that somebody is breathing. It's like, oh my gosh, everything just really goes crazy. And this is one of the reasons why, I don't know if you've ever sat in a lecture hall. I know I've watched just lectures that we do in our department. And you put enough people in there and you start increasing the CO2 in the room, you get two choices. You either start breathing more to get more oxygen and keep yourself awake, or you're going to fall asleep during the lecture, which I've seen many of you do before. So realize that what I'm trying to say is carbon dioxide is really important for driving how you're going to breathe, even though we always want to focus on the oxygen. So what do we see when we go to a game? If you see a football game, oftentimes, and especially if they're playing someplace in Denver, everybody's sucking on the oxygen. It's like they give them all of this supplemental oxygen to bring in. And it solves one of the problems of that pathway that I had shown you, but it doesn't solve everything. And even celebrities, this is Michael Jackson. And, before he died, he had this thing where he felt that he would, one, stay younger, and two, be able to perform better if at night he slept in a hyperbaric chamber. And it just doesn't work that way. It's not going to help them offload CO2. It's not going to cause better recovery. It's an immediate response for blood oxygen, but oxygen actually breaks down tissues ultimately. So it really didn't help them. And the crazy thing going on right now is you can have your own oxygen source. There's all kinds of inhalers that they're saying you should have with you along with a bottle of water, and you got everything you need for exercising. I mean, look at this person. This is not a high altitude kind of situation here. This is sitting at the lake saying, I think I'll take a boost of oxygen just to give myself some designer supplement, and hopefully I'm going to feel a lot better when I'm exercising. Makes you a little lightheaded, but it's not going to solve the problem. And here's the issue. The honest truth about oxygen is that all of these gases, whether it's blood oxygen or blood CO2, it has to be maintained at a pretty prescribed level, and your body's going to do that naturally. If you start to mess around with your respiration rate, if you mess around with supplemental oxygen and that kind of thing, you're going to create problems. And we know this because of work that was done on Navy divers. And I am astounded when you go into these records. If you want to see some crazy stuff, it was how they developed the scuba diving tables based on what they did to Navy divers in the 1940s and even to the 50s. And they would have people on oxygen. They thought, instead of air in a scuba tank, let's give people supplemental oxygen, keep them on it for hours, and just see what would happen. Well, the thing that they did was they actually made the poor divers toxic. So these are the problems that happen with high oxygen pressures. If you give supplemental oxygen for long periods of time, especially at high levels, you throw off everything. You become toxic from your capillaries, pulmonary damage happens, you get hypoxemia, acidosis, death, retinal damage, so eyesight gets cut down, renal damage, big one, hepatic, liver problems right here. It's amazing. This is crazy. Twitching, convulsions, because you've got neurons that are dying. You can't, you just can't artificially do these kinds of things. And the body closely regulates your oxygen and CO2 levels. And so you trying to do it yourself just has never worked. And as I said, they prove that with these poor Navy divers. And it's one of the reasons why I think anesthesiologists get paid so much. Trying to regulate those blood gases in a patient, in a premature born baby, during scuba, all of these things take a lot of physiology to get it right, because you can mess things up both by going with too much oxygen or a body that doesn't have enough. So just realize, as I'm talking about athletes and, VDOT O2 max and all these cool ways to be a better athlete, we're always focusing on sort of your aerobic capacity, and especially for an endurance kind of activity. And the truth of the matter is you can only modify it so much. You can modify it with training. That's a natural way to try and do it. But the moment you start overriding what training is going to do and get into these supplements or other kinds of mechanical breathing, I guess they're programs that people are doing now. I think there's a popular one now where I'm looking at this just going, this is insane. It's one where you wear like a mouthpiece. It's almost like a scuba mouthpiece, and it's got a narrow opening to it. So breathing through a straw, essentially, it's one of the craziest things I've ever seen. The idea is that you would cut down the amount of oxygen coming in with each breath, would make your lungs work harder. You would be slightly hypoxic, and therefore your tissues would get stronger and make themselves better at bringing in more oxygen, sort of like going to altitude and having less O2. Craziest thing I ever saw. If you want to have subcutaneous emphysema occur, that's probably one of the best ways I know to have it happen. And actually the Navy divers did exactly that. So anyway, bottom line, don't mess around with nature. Get your oxygen naturally. And the only time I could ever recommend it is if you go to the top of Everest. Not a lot of oxygen up there, so high altitude, I'll give you a buy on your oxygen bottle there. Oh my goodness, I have all my notes here. I'm going to erase this because I want you to draw it. Brought the wrong file up and I'm too lazy to get the other one. Okay, so the oxygen pathway. For those of you that have been in animal physiology, you're going to get a little bit of a review here. Just realize that we're coloring everything that I said about animals and the oxygen pathway and movement of oxygen with human exercise physiology. So a little bit more detail, so don't think that you've already had all of this already. So I'm going to draw this out here. This is the way that I want you to study the oxygen pathway, and the way that I think is the simplest. Books just make it so complicated, and I'll show you in a second. So for our pathway, if I can get my pen to work. Oh, it's on the eraser. Durr. So we start off with our lungs. We just do a general lung like this. And we've got a barrier between the lung and the second compartment, which is our cardiovascular system. That's the heart, all the veins, all the arteries and such. We got another barrier that we're going to try and get our oxygen through. And then we have our cell with our mitochondria. So for you, the compartments of the oxygen pathway are three. There's the lungs, the cardiovascular system, and the muscle cell or tissues, but we're interested in skeletal muscles and that kind of thing. Just realize that we have three compartments and that these are the simple ways. Let's all yell at Antonia. Sorry. And what we're trying to do is move oxygen from the air into our lungs, get it across that barrier, into our cardiovascular system, move it around with the heart, get it into our cells, and eventually get our mitochondria to take that oxygen and turn it into ATP for energy. So this is our lightning bolt energy. That allows us to basically power the muscles, okay? And I have a question. I'm going to give this to you, Jason. If I draw over, nope, it doesn't work. Doesn't matter. It only draws on the picture.
Oh.
Yeah, I was hoping I had some extra room here, but I don't. So anyway, this is the pathway that I'd like you guys to know. And then this is a pathway that you get in your books and that kind of thing. It's the same idea, it's just that it's a little bit fancier. And the point that it's trying to make is that we've got our O2 out here, and that we have the 3 compartments that I just gave you, but it's these barriers, these areas that are sort of controlling where the oxygen is moving between those compartments that at times become really important, both in terms of disease. COVID disease is certainly one, and in terms of what you can improve as an athlete. So looking at this, here's a question for you. Which of these compartments, which of these barriers can be improved by training? This is something that coaches and athletes and the supplement makers, this is what they're trying to figure out. Where along this pathway can we improve things and make a better athlete because we're able to move more oxygen? And what are the barriers? You know, what are the things that we have to worry about? And so I can't do a poll in the middle of this when I'm in tablet mode, but my big questions are, you know, can we do anything about the lungs? Can we make, can we get more or larger lungs with training? Can we change things in the vascular system? So the heart and blood, red blood cells and that kind of thing. We know that we can improve muscles. We know that muscles can get bigger. Wow. And so there's obviously places that we can have improvement, but the question is, where do we get the biggest improvement? And what do we focus on? And what things can we not do? There's been a lot of people thinking that, well, let's change ventilatory characteristics and lung characteristics and such. The truth is, there's not a lot you can do about your lungs. What you have is what you get. But the next graph shows you really what we're going to be looking at in our class, and the kinds of things that training really can change. And this is it. So this is important for you, and I apologize, I've done all these notes before, so we're just going to erase them as we go. But this graph shows you that oxygen pathway, and this is really critical in terms of you understanding this list. We'll go through each of these compartments in the next few lectures, but it gives you a good idea of what you really can change. And as I said, when it comes to ventilation, pulmonary O2 diffusion, even if you go up to altitude and train there for a long period of time, you're not going to be able to change much when it comes to the lungs. About the only thing, and it's minor, is if you want to say that maybe the number of capillaries or capillary blood volume or something like that has changed, but really not a lot in terms of what an athlete can change and do about their lungs. The really big one is this. If you want to make somebody more aerobic, then try to do exercises that are going to improve the cardiovascular system. So we see changes in heart rate, changes in stroke volume. That's the amount of blood that you move with each heart rate or each heartbeat. We can change hemoglobin concentration in the blood. We can change hematocrit, how many red blood cells you have in your blood. So things that are happening in your blood, things in the cardiovascular system, things related to even the size of your heart, all those will change with training and the different kinds of training, whether it's power or endurance. All of those things can change. Well, and so here's the deal. This is why so many of our bicycling athletes, especially the Tour de France, blood doping. This is where it comes in. Realizing that the big effect you can have is on the vascular system. That has been one of the biggest problems with endurance athletes and cheating, because blood doping is a way that you can achieve a better aerobic scope. And then we do know that there is improvement that's going to happen in the muscles themselves. The thing that's sort of cool that we don't really pay attention to, because most people aren't going to go out and get biopsies, but your mitochondria, the little powerhouses here that are going to be turning ADP into your ATP and energy, you can get more volume of mitochondria. You can make it more complex in terms of how many little cristae are in there, so the surface area. Enzymes that are in the muscles, lots of things can change in the muscle. So yes, we know about improvements of training for muscle, but the heart and blood are going to be major areas where we're going to be able to improve things. And nothing really for the pulmonary. So this is important, as I said, knowing these training effects and which of the compartments of the oxygen pathway we can change, okay? So let's look a little bit at delivering the actual oxygen to the muscles in our athletes. So this is where we get into the actual pulmonary ventilation and how we get oxygen in and how we're going to try and move it around the body. So this is what I mean about the really pretty pictures that you have in your book for pulmonary ventilation. It shows you tracheas, and just as a definition, pulmonary ventilation is just related to the process of moving and exchanging ambient air with the air in the lungs. So how do we get the tissues of the lungs to essentially pick up that oxygen that we want to use? So it's O2 out here, and we're trying to get it in here. I hate pictures like this. I don't know if you get anything out of this, but I know what I'm talking about and I don't get anything out of it. It's like, this is without a doubt the most complicated picture I've ever seen in terms of what's going on. I don't even know what that is. You know, I'm going to ignore that because that is way, I think it's inside the mitochondria. No, I guess it's the alveoli. Nuts. So this is crazy, but this is what your book is showing. So just realize that what I'm talking about is the cartoon version of what you've got right here. And if this kind of thing works for you, then great, but let's do it a little bit simpler here. And as I said, I was practicing. So we'll do it all here again. All right, this is how I want you to take that graph and turn it into something that you're going to be able to remember. So what we're trying to do is get the oxygen from the air. We're going to get it into the lungs, and we're going to have it go through to the alveoli. In terms of a drawing, if I've got you doing a drawing on a test, this is the kind of thing I'd like to see. Here's your trachea. Here are the bronchi. Here's the lung. Here's the other lung. And you know that we're going to get into a bunch of smaller and smaller tubes here. And eventually you get down to the alveoli. And that's really where we want to get this O2 to reach. So we're just trying to move air all the way down into the smallest part of your lungs, which is known as the alveoli. And if we take a cross section there, here's my arrow. This is what I want you to have for an alveolus. So that's just one of the alveoli that are there. So a single one, it's just called an alveolus. And it's just this line-ended sac. It's where we want the air to come into. We want oxygen arriving in here. And this whole little sac, here, I'll do it in colors. Look at, I can change colors. It's awesome. Ha! I hope you have colored pens. So we can cover this whole thing with capillaries. All right. And so that's how we're moving oxygen through a single alveolus and then finally into our cardiovascular system. It's because you've got this bubble that is essentially covered with all of these capillaries. So this is the kind of drawing that if you did this, I'd know that you really understood what was going on with the pulmonary system. And I wouldn't worry about those really complex things that they have in your beautiful texts, because while they're pretty, I think that graphically they're really hard to understand. Like I said, I don't even understand them, and I'm supposed to know this stuff. So make sure that you can draw these things. I don't know how I'm going to do it on a test, but we'll figure out a way for you to do some sketching. As far as the respiratory anatomy, this is a little complex, but I'll just tell you the main things that I want you to know. So again, we're taking air, trying to get oxygen out of that air into your trachea. So you guys pretty well know the name of that. I'm not going to have you worry too much about all the different names that we have here, except for a couple of things. You'll notice that you have a blue zone right here, and you've got sort of an orange or rust-colored zone here. This whole top zone, from your trachea to all of these various bronchi as they're getting smaller and smaller and moving oxygen in, is known as a conducting zone. So realize you've got a bunch of anatomical pipes known as your conducting zone. It starts with the trachea, goes into primary bronchi, etc. And that these pipes are basically just moving the gases. But they do not contain alveoli. There is no gas exchange. So the idea here, I'm just going to put no exchange. These conducting zones are terrific because they're large diameter tubes, but there's no gas exchange that's going to happen there because there's no alveoli in this area. And the alveoli is where all the action is happening for gas exchange. It's where those capillaries are coming close to the air in a really thin-walled sac. And so that's where things happen, but not in these conducting zones. All right, so this is a really important concept, because that means all the air that you're breathing into those great big pipes is considered anatomical. Oh, I spelled it wrong. Anatomical. So it's anatomical dead space. Meaning that these are just tubes that are helping to transport the air to the alveoli, but it is not where gas exchange is happening. And this is going to have big implications for an athlete if you're trying to breathe really deeply, or if you're taking a lot of breaths and your breathing frequency goes up. This anatomical dead space is going to become really important. The rest of this, though, is that respiratory zone. So this is where the alveoli are, and that's where your gas exchange happens. All right, so everywhere that you've got alveoli, and they've got all these little spots all over here, that's where gas exchange actually is happening. So from this graph, just remember, you've got conducting zones, you have respiratory zones. They're differentiated by whether or not they have alveoli, and it makes the difference in terms of where we're going to be exchanging our gases. And in that conducting zone, you end up with areas of no gas exchange, and we just call it anatomical dead space. And by that, it's just dead space for exchanging gas. Got it. This is sort of a repeat of what I was just talking about. The reason I like this graph is over here. This is our alveolus again. It's a little bit prettier, but it at least shows you, oxygen moving in and carbon dioxide moving out. The other reason I like it is because it shows you that this is a pretty thin barrier for moving our oxygen and our carbon dioxide. But literally, they are talking about, a single cell surface that we're getting through right here to get gases across, and then only one cell surface to get through the capillary. So it's a thin, thin barrier. We don't want anything that's going to essentially block our ability to move oxygen and carbon dioxide. And that's the whole point here, that we are trying to move our gases through seamlessly. There's no transporters, there's nothing that's helping to move these things. It's simply that it's going to diffuse across this thin barrier. So that's the good news. It can happen really quickly, especially for carbon dioxide. It's about 20 times faster than oxygen moving through, but it's because it's a thin barrier. And the structure of the alveoli and the capillary enables that to happen very quickly. So now I'm trying to remember what picture I want there. Oh, I know what I want to do. So this is just a repeat of what I said above, and this is what I've really said a lot above, and the idea that the alveoli are the gas exchange surface. And the thing I want to put in the white square here is the model that we use all the time for just talking about gas exchange. So it looks like this, and I know it sort of looks like the lung that I drew before, but this is just one alveoli, or alveolus. And then we want to connect it, rather than drawing all those capillaries. Here, I'll draw it in color again, just because it's fun. Here's our cool capillary. I think I'm digging this pad thing.
Seems to work pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot more fun. So here's our air. I can spell it. Air O2 coming into the single alveolus. We got it sitting in here. Now we're going to get it into our capillary. Here's our red blood cell. And it's zooming in here. It's going to come across here. And essentially, the red blood cell is going to be picking up the oxygen. I'm getting fancy now. And now it's filled, all red and filled with oxygen. And then out, and it delivers the oxygen to the tissues. So this is the concept that I want you to have, that we've got our alveolus, and it's right next to a capillary, and we're going to use this over and over again in the next few slides just to explain how we are getting the oxygen out of the lungs and finally into the capillary system. So be able to draw that in the end. I know it's not hard. It's like a tube and a bubble. All right, real quick things about the actual mechanics of breathing in an athlete. It's really funny. People, when they start coaching and such, you always get questions. Well, should I breathe really deeply? Should I breathe faster? Should I do this or that? And the fact of the matter is the body's going to take care of it itself. Swimming is a little bit different in that, but for running and biking, you sort of let the body do what it's going to do. And this is what it's going to do as far as moving air. Inspiration, thing you need to remember, diaphragm. This big muscle in the bottom of your thorax, big sheep, and it is the primary ventilatory muscle. And I've told people this before. You've got all kinds of muscles, intercostal muscles here, and the truth of the matter is you could paralyze all of these intercostal muscles and it really wouldn't make a big difference in terms of your inspiration because the diaphragm is doing it all. So realize that for inspiration, we're just moving the diaphragm down and expanding the thorax, and air is going to go in. If you remember the name diaphragm, you're doing really well with inspiration. Expiration, you don't even need to think about it. During rest, expiration is passive. You've got so much recoil, you've got so much elastic tissue in the lungs. You have so many things going on that you really don't need to think about, oh, it's time for me to exhale. And it's because it's pretty well taken care of by the elasticity of the lungs. When you get to high to moderate exercise, you have the intercostal muscles, abdominal muscles that'll be involved in this. You know, these are the kinds of things that will cramp. You know, that stitch in your side when you're exercising. You haven't done it in a while. This is sort of the location of it. A lot of times intercostal muscles will get cramped too. As I said, they are sort of a secondary muscle and only one that gets pulled in when you're really, really exercising at high levels, running really fast. All right. We can measure lung volumes. So this is the kind of thing where you'll take an individual. This picture cracks me up. I am sure that none of you have ever seen anything like this. This is something that I saw when I was in graduate school, and they would take you, and even then it was old. So you can believe this is ancient. They would have this like metal container, and you would sit there and you put this little mouthpiece in right here, and you would breathe into this thing and the air would come here, and it was sitting in water, and it had this little weird pulley on top of it, and you would fill this area with the gases coming out, and this little bellows would move up and down, and it had a little pen recording, and it would come up and down like this. Then you would take a big breath, and then it would give you sort of your tidal volume that way. So it was a way to mechanically measure your breathing and your breathing volumes. Here's Lance Armstrong, and this is the way that you do it now. You basically set a person up, they're breathing, they have their nose clipped. We would do this in the classroom here for you. Maybe at the end, who knows, maybe we'll be able to do something in June. Put a nose clip on you, put a mouthpiece on, and then have you breathe into this. And digitally, you can record how big a breath a person takes normally during exercise or, during rest. There are a whole series of, pardon?
Sorry, I think one of the students was hoping you could go back to the previous slide for a few seconds. Just
Oh, sure.
maybe at the end of that one.
Ooh, this is good. Hold on. There. What do we need?
Sounds like you just needed a few more seconds.
Oh. Yeah, I'm talking pretty fast. Sorry, guys. It's like without people and me seeing you right, I'm like, all right, we're powering through this.
Pacing is hard in person. I can't imagine how hard this is.
What's that?
The pacing a lecture is hard in person. Doing it on video is.
I know. I'm sitting there and I'm trying to pause between the slides and I'm sort of going, oh, come on. I'm looking at the clock. Oh, I'm racing the clock now.
It's easier in person. We can see if you all are taking notes or not.
I know. I should have everybody's picture on the side here. I'd be like, oh man, they're all asleep. They're all eating. Somebody's probably already cracked a beer, I'm sure. All right, I'm moving on. Basically underlined stuff.
Like you said, they're all set. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right, so for these lung volumes, there's a whole series of volumes, and in fact, I give them all in animal physiology. The ones that we're going to use in exercise physiology are these two, so I want you to know essentially what they are. When I'm talking about the tidal volume, this is the amount of air that's moved in an average ventilatory cycle. So in other words, in an average breath, how much air do you actually move? You're moving 500 mils of air. That's typical tidal volume. It can be a little bit larger for males, but we're going to use 500 just because the mathematics are a lot easier. That's what this part is showing you right here. It's got the tidal volume TV there, and it's just showing you inspiration, expiration, inspiration, expiration. So that's what's happening when you're breathing. So they're little peaks because it's only 500 mils of air that you're moving. The other volume I want you to know is the total lung volume. This is also sometimes called the total lung capacity. Your book uses total lung volume. There are other groups that call this total lung capacity. I'll take either one of them. One's a little bit more right than the other, but I'm not going to go through the details of it. Just realize that right now, this is often used, can be exchanged, essentially. Either one of these will work for me. What I wanted you to know is that there is a lung volume, and this is the total volume of air that's moved from max inspiration to max expiration. So in other words, I've got Lance Armstrong here on his bicycle, and I'm going to ask him, take the biggest inspiration that you can, and then go to the biggest expiration. So take a big breath in, and then exhale as hard as you can. Try and contract all those muscles. And if you do that, you get the total lung volume of your individual or your athlete. And here are the sort of the sizes that we get. And again, unfortunately, we would do this in the lab and just see what you guys could do. But it's about 3,200 mils for a woman, 3.2 liters. Liters are going to become important later when we do some calculations. And for men, 4.8 liters or 4,800 mils. So you can at least see the difference between those two. 500 for just a simple breath, and then you can really crank up the volume when you do a max inspiration to expiration. So know these two volumes, and in terms of numbers that you have in your head, Definitely know what a tidal volume is. It's about as much as a cup of coffee. And then know that we can get a lot higher when we start exercising. I'm not going to go into details of this. You can read this on your own. I just thought it was interesting that when you've got somebody that is really obese, you really start to cut down on these volumes for breathing. And you realize mechanically just how hard it is for an individual to exercise, even if they wanted to get out of the obesity problem and start to exercise, cut down diet and such, their ability to move air. So this volume right here and this volume right here is sort of showing you how much air that they're able to move. And the point is that if you are overweight, if you're obese, you've really cut down in your ability to actually move air as you are exercising. So it's an uphill battle if you're obese. And then this table just gives you a sense of what you're fighting with in terms of trying to even catch a breath when you are overweight. Okay? So that's just for your own information. Now, remember I told you that there isn't a whole lot of change that you can do to your lungs as far as exercise and training. So that's what this part is showing you right here. It's just that your functional capacity, how much you are able to actually move air, is not going to be changed that much in terms of the actual structure of the lung. Now, having said that, I do remember when I was doing scuba dive training and I was down at Scripps, and there was this guy, this is Jim Stewart, and he was the dive master. And I'm looking at that guy, and he had the biggest barrel chest of anyone I knew. And I started looking at divers, and even our own, the dive master that we had before our current Steve Claybush, I looked at him and I said, wow, you got a big barrel chest. And then John Pierce, big diver in the Antarctic. He used to teach invertebrate biology here before Baldo, big barrel chest. And I'm like, there's gotta be something to diving on scuba all those years. And I mean, years and years and years, and having this barrel chest. And I'll be darned, it does turn out that in swimmers and scuba divers, you can have and potentially develop a larger than normal total lung volume. And I think that this is at one level a little bit aberrant in that it's a forced pressurized kind of breathing, especially for scuba divers. And they believe that they've strengthened the inspiratory muscles, and it's because you're working against pressure at depth. And I think a lot of it is related to working against that scuba regulator. Whether that conferred any endurance capability increase for these guys, I don't think so. I've never seen a study that says that that it can change, but just realize that that there are some mechanical things that can happen. The reason I show this dog is that it's a Chesapeake Bay Retriever, and they're bred specifically for diving and swimming, and they tend to have a big barrel chest. So who knows? Maybe it works.
There's a question about if the intercostal muscles are also growing at the same time, and how many years it might take for the change to occur.
This is a lifetime. These scuba divers are across a lifetime. For the dogs, it's a breeding thing. And yeah, I think that it's, when you see these guys, it's that the chest always seems to be in this wide inspiration kind of mode. And so I'm figuring that the intercostal muscles have to be involved in that. It's not just the diaphragm moving down. It's just that it's almost as if the ribs are in many ways always expanded in order to accept the gas. I don't know. No, it's just something that I've noticed, and I believe that it's there. But if I took these guys and put them on a bicycle ergometer and tried to measure their B.O2 max, I don't think it would change it. It just changed the mechanics of how they breathe. All right, a couple of really quick things I hope for you so that we can finish up, because these are important. And I know that you've got other classes. So I have been told two things about this class. What time does this class officially end? How about student tell Jason, and then you tell me.
Well, I think it's officially supposed to be 11:30, but I'm not seeing anything from the students yet.
Okay, that's what I had. And that is, I have heard other things. So I'm not gonna give falsehoods then. I think
I can look it up real quick.
No, I looked it up and it is 11:30, but then somebody told me that it was only supposed to be an hour, and I'm like, shoot, no, I got too much stuff. Okay.
It's like 11:35 from one of them.
All right, you guys, hang in there. I'm almost done. We're going to go through these so that you can fill in the blanks and you can look at it later. So, breathing like an athlete. Concept I want you to know. Minute ventilation. Minute ventilation is the total amount of air that you're moving in 1 minute. It's just how much air do you move as you're breathing for a minute. And the equation for that is right here. We're going to take your tidal volume. So this is how much air in each breath. And then we're just multiplying that by basically the number of breaths. Per minute. So how many breaths you're taking in 60 seconds times how much air in each breath gives me an idea of how much you've breathed. So we'll use our little alveoli picture. Oops. Picture here, just to give us an idea of where we're at. Normal breath. I'm talking about what's happening in terms of air coming in and out. We're going to be moving our O2 into there. So for rest, what did I tell you the tidal volume was for you? 500 mils. So your coffee cup sized full of air is going to come into your lungs, I'll just say into your lungs. Number of breaths per minute typically at rest is about 15 breaths per minute. So that's essentially what we're going to be delivering over to your lungs. So to do the calculation, really easy. 500 times 15, and you end up with 7,500 mils of air that's going to be moved per minute that's actually coming into your lungs. All right, really simple calculation. Just trying for me to figure out with my athlete, how much air are you able to move? Because I'm going to try and determine your capability of moving that air and how aerobic you're going to be. We can go ahead and say, well, that's the amount of air that's coming into the lung. But we're not really worried about that as much as we're worried about how much air is coming into the alveoli. That's the critical number here. So the alveolar ventilation is the portion of inspired air that actually reaches the alveoli. And we want to know that because this is where gas exchange is happening. So really, really important for us to understand this, because this is going to be dictating what happens with all that anatomical dead space. Remember, I told you, you got to suck in a bunch of air, and all it's going to do is fill up your trachea, fill up your bronchi. No gas exchange has happened. So we got to take into account the fact that you've got this anatomical dead space in there that isn't really helping you to bring in any oxygen because no gas exchange is happening there. So for us to do the calculation, we're going to take your tidal volume again that we had. We're going to subtract out the anatomical dead space because that doesn't count for gas exchange. And then we'll time that by your breathing frequency per minute. So all we've done is added in an accounting for that anatomical dead space. What did I tell you before? Tidal volume, 500 mils. If you were sitting in the classroom, I'd make you say that. And then for breaths per minute, you're still at rest, remember. And so we have 15 breaths per minute. And then our anatomical dead space. I told you in the previous graphs, but in case you didn't remember, it's about 150 mils. So every time you take a breath of 500 mils, you're going to have to subtract out 150 mils because of that anatomical dead space. So the calculation is our 500 mils of our tidal volume minus the 150 of our anatomical dead space, times that by your breathing frequency, and you now end up with 5,250 mils of air per minute. And here's our little alveolus that's actually reaching down into the space of your lungs where you're going to be able to use them and transfer it to red blood cells. The thing to remember is just that you've lost a lot of what I just said. If you look up in the graph before, 7,500 mils of air you've moved into your lungs, but in actual fact, it's only 5,250 mils per minute that actually get to an area that you're going to be able to exchange your gases. That's an important concept, that alveolar ventilation is different than your minute ventilation. And the reason it becomes important is here. And I can't go through all the details. I want you to take a look at this table a little bit more. But it answers the question, should you take more breaths during exercise or should you breathe deeply? And the truth is, you really can't change a whole lot, but let's imagine that people are trying to modify things with training to become the better athlete. So look at this. Over here, normal breathing. Here's your tidal volume, 500 mils. Here they're taking 12 breaths per minute, similar to us. What they're trying to do is get to a minute ventilation that's the same for all these calculations. So they end up with 6,000 mils per minute. They account for the dead space here. And here's their alveolar minute ventilation, and you're at 42. So that's similar to what we just did in terms of our calculation. We were at 52. If you go to deep breathing, so now you're taking in twice the tidal volume, you're going to cut down your breathing rate. You still end up with the same minute ventilation. They sort of force these numbers to create that. But what you end up with is, with deep breathing, potentially a slightly higher alveolar minute ventilation. And look what happens if you try to go for shallow breathing. So you're like panting. So you got tidal volume only 150. You're breathing like panting just every like second almost, 40 breaths per minute. That was forced to get that same minute ventilation, and you end up with zero. If you're panting that fast with that small of a tidal volume, all you're doing is moving air in and out of your trachea and bronchi, never even able to do any kind of alveolar ventilation. And these are obviously extremes, but you get the sense of, wow, stick with normal breathing, really, as far as trying to bring in a lot of air without a lot of effort. It's a big deal to try and change your tidal volume by twice, and you're not getting that much of an advantage over here. So anyway, take a look at this table, but it really gives you a sense that if somebody gets into a situation where they're breathing really, really quickly, you got a problem. And then I'm not going to go and just read those. Bottom line in all of this, regulation of breathing. You have the medulla in your brain. It's a respiratory center. All I need for you to know is that your brain is controlling what you're doing with your breathing. And it's picking up information from all kinds of areas that I'm not going to go into. The only bottom line is breathe naturally, because there's so much that's going to override anything that you try to do that is probably going to work against you. So I started off saying that breathe oxygen, don't bring in supplemental oxygen. Your body already is trying to figure out what to do with O2 and CO2. And in terms of trying to regulate your ventilation, it's like, don't even bother. You got baroreceptors, chemoreceptors, stretch receptors, temperature, all these things are going to affect things. And the medulla is going to just take it all in and figure out what your breathing is going to be. All right. So medulla, a little fast, but the only thing I care about you getting off of this graph is the medulla in your brain is controlling everything. That's the master switch for ventilation. And there's a lot of things that are affecting it. So one more little bit here, and we are almost done, because I want to get to hard exercise. Everything I've been talking about so far has been just related to rest. So what happens when you start to exercise, this time really, really hard? We're going to be taking you, here's your lung again, and we're going to, or alveoli with some capillaries, and we're going to be trying to be moving in a lot of air because you are exercising hard and everything is going to be changing at this point.
There's one question.
Yeah.
Andrew's wondering if he'd said that, he'd heard that for recovery between sets, coaches would advise their athletes to take slower, deep breaths.
Well, they said the coach said that, or?
Yep.
I can see that, because look at what's happening. If you're trying to recover and you get into a panting mode, you're going to end up not having much of a recovery. You're basically going to defeat the purpose of the recovery period, because you've just basically moved a heck of a lot of air through your respiratory dead zone and never had it get to your alveoli. So that's the perfect thing to do as you're getting into a recovery, is to try and get a slower breath going. Now, having said that, remember, you're sort of overriding things a little bit here, where the brain is going to be trying to regulate things automatically for you. But I could see an advantage where, you've gotten into almost a reflexive thing where it's like, oh, I got to breathe really fast and I'm panting. And they're like, slow down, and that's almost a mental thing, slow down and take a deep breath. So they're right in terms of this graph. If you can breathe a little bit deeper instead of panting, you're going to be able to bring in more oxygen than what's going to happen here if you're panting. So that's the logic. Okay?
Sounds good.
Okay. So one last equation, then that's it. We get to hard exercise, and this is what's going to happen. Your tidal volume can go upwards of 2,000 mils. So you've got a 4-fold change in your tidal volume from rest. I told you rest was 500. Now we're going to go up to 2,000. So you're taking in a much larger volume of air for your breath. Breaths per minute, you know when you're exercising, especially really hard, that your breathing rate can increase. So the number of breaths per minute can go up to 60. And again, this is a level that's 4 times rest. And this is not unusual to get this kind of a response during hard exercise. So if you go through just the minute ventilation, we're not even going to bother with alveolar. You can do that on your own if you want. We're now at 2,000 times 60, and you are bringing in, during heavy exercise, 120,000 mils of air per minute. That's 120 liters of air per minute. So what's happening is we have 16-time change in going from rest to max exercise. All right. So these are just giving you an idea of what is that? I don't know where that came in there. Make it go away. Does anyone know how? That is strange. Sorry, guys. I don't know. I'm leaving it.
Yeah.
Just realize 16 times the amount of air in going to max exercise. Just to give you an idea of where we are with this, the highest ventilation that's ever been recorded is equal to 208 liters per minute. And I was actually surprised at the person that this actually happened with. And this was for a football player I don't even know his position. They wouldn't say, a football player on a bike test. So they brought him into the lab. This guy was huge, I do know that. And he was able to move 208 liters per minute. It was unbelievable. All right, it is 11, almost 11:30. I'm gonna stop right there. Yep, because I got a couple things. I'm going to start up on this the next time just to do a couple more graphs. This